Hello everyone. I am Vicky Murillo, the director of the Institute for Latin American Studies at Columbia University. I want to welcome you all to this extraordinary discussion on Bukele's El Salvador and its regional implications on democracy and security, which is co-sponsored by the Institute, the Center for Mexico and Central America, and the Latin American Students Association of CIPA. For other events, if you're interested, please register for our newsletter or on our website or follow us in social media. A week ago, President Nayib Bukele was re-elected in El Salvador, although the constitution of that country prohibits its re-election. He announced he received 85% of the vote and that his party won 58 of 60 seats in the unicameral assembly, although the official counting of votes has still not been announced. In a region where 8% of the population live, but where a third of the homicides in the world happen, Bukele's fight against the gangs in El Salvador has gained worldwide attention and is inspired imitations through the region, as has his style of concentration of power at the expenses of check and balance. To help us understand the consequences of this election, not just for El Salvador, but also for the region, we have an extraordinary panel with us. We have, to my extreme right, Luis Villaherrera, who's the Salvadorian in the panel. He's the founder and president at Tracoda, Transparency, Social Control, and Open Data, and the creator of the first web app in Central America, Go Data, which aims to democratize public information. And Luis is also the first Obama scholar from Central America at Columbia University. Next to him, we have Veronica Zubillaga, who's a Venezuelan sociology with a PhD from the Catholic University of Louvain, and she's our Tinker visiting professor at the ILAS. She's a professor also at the University Simón Bolivar in Caracas and an expert on urban violence in Latin America. She has combined academia with incidence work on armed violence, advocating armed control and disarmaments and reparations related to police violence in Venezuela. She just published The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela with David Smith and Rebecca Hanson that she will be presented at ILAS soon. And finally, I have to my right, Will Freeman, who's a fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He received his PhD from Princeton University, and his writing appeared in Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, The Economist, the Journal of Democracy, the Washington Post, and American Quarterly. And he just returned from El Salvador, right? So we have an extraordinary panel. I leave it to you. Shall we start from in this direction with Luis?
Okay. I use this phrase that I'm from the countries of wonders because I wonder where my democracy is. And now more than ever, that's so real. And I'm also in black because they killed democracy a few days ago. What happened in El Salvador has been not a surprise by a lot of Salvadorians. President Nayib Bukele has so much popularity because for sure, we cannot debate that the results of the security measures of Estado de Excepción has been effective. We were a very violent country. And then with the Estado de Excepción or exception state, that changed. People in the streets feel safe. But with that, we need to ask ourselves that there's like more consequences because we have 3% of the population in jail without due process. People is dying in jails. And recently, the elections, the results were published by the President Nayib Bukele and his channels before the only institutions who had the authority to say this political party wins. So he used all his communication strategies to say we won 85 seats in the Congress.
58 out of 60.
58 seats in the Congress, even though the Supreme Electoral Tribunal didn't show any public statements saying that. It's also important to acknowledge that the results of the presidential election was the results were given by the tribunal like 2 or 3 days after the election day, but the international community congratulate him because he was the winner, without waiting for the official results. What is happening right now in El Salvador is a model for other countries, or in their imagination is a model, but we need to think and ask ourselves, is going to be sustainable? With 3% of the population in jail, people dying inside of the jails, and families that before had like the bread maker is not there anymore, that is going to bring a lot of consequences in the long run. I don't think it's going to be sustainable, but if we start talking about the communication strategies, when people ask about El Salvador, it's a beautiful place. Everyone that I met is like, oh, I saw videos about El Salvador, how much has changed. It's super safe. But the fear in the people has shifted from the gangs to the police officers to the militaries. And that's a reality. And I was telling this story that my organization works in a grassroots levels too. And the thing was like this, let's call him Juan. Juan was happy, even though he was for more than 1 month in jail, and he's not a gang member. But he expressed to my team that he was fine with that because he was safe in his community. So that's crazy. That's really crazy. That's really messed up. But a lot of people is thinking the same. And the government has this machine, electoral, like a public communication machine, so powerful that people are thinking that everything is okay, that everything is fine. And because right now we're safe, the president needs to keep the power. And we also have in the process of elections, because it's been like it's like a comedy series or like a sad series. I don't know. Like right now, I prefer to laugh rather than cry. But the thing is, like, we have a Venezuelan in the electoral discussions, Lester. He was there. He was defending democracy in Venezuela, but he's imposing authoritarianism in El Salvador. And we also have like people from the Engels list running the show for Nuevas Ideas. And that's, I mean, the whole process of the election is a sham. It's crazy. And you can read like a lot of information because the system didn't work, and they were putting the votes towards Nuevas Ideas for them to win the majority of the seats. They are worried because they are not that sure that they are going to win the majority, and they need that to keep the exception state. And I'm going to leave it like that to keep something. Yeah.
Veronica?
Okay. Well, I will read because of my English. Yes. Well, I have to say that I have more questions than answers. Rather than a systematic reflection, I would like to share some concerns and worries as a Latin American and Venezuelan activist and researcher. So you have compared you have spoken about Venezuelans in El Salvador, and I will start saying also that I found meaningful that Jean Maines, the former US diplomat in El Salvador, once compared Bukele to Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, without ignoring the enormous differences between the cases, as well as the difference in the popularity of Bukele, the most cool dictator, with the rejection generated by Nicolás Maduro, the most hated dictator in Latin America. The parallelisms seems to be promising to think about the possible mutations in the mano dura model in the region in context of states of exception and social acceptability of these states. So the case of El Salvador and Venezuela, even when they present very different histories, present certain structural isomorphisms in their tendencies that I think it is pertinent to present here in order to think about the implications of the Bukele model in the region. The passage from of a massive prison punitivism to a systematic slaughter that we have experienced in Venezuela is one, I will say, one of the plausible potential future trajectories of the mano dura in context of a state of exception, such as in El Salvador. Of course, I agree that we have to have a longitudinal perspective. This means that time and volatility in the relationships between the state and gangs and among these gangs is very important for our analysis. So both El Salvador and Venezuela have histories of intense militarization, and their criminal groups, although they have become more organized and sophisticated over time, they are not comparable to the levels of organization and involvement in international drug trafficking, as is in the case of Mexico or Colombia, for example. In the past, Venezuela and El Salvador have had some similar trajectories in terms of their security model. For instance, deployment of a massive prison punitivism that produces a rapid growth of the prison population, loss of control of the prisons, reorganization and strengthening of the criminal groups, pacts with the criminal groups, breaking of the pacts, return to the mano dura policies, which this is the case of Venezuela, which in the Venezuelan context of the state of exception, in the framework of all the militarized anti-crime operations, we turned into this systematic slaughter, or the crudest exercise of necropolitics. So the case of Venezuela, which is an understudied case in the region, could reflect a possible horizon of the mano dura policies in contexts of moral panic and social acceptability of the state of exception, such as in El Salvador now. So the Bukele model could well go through this itinerary from prison punitivism to systematic killings that we have lived in Venezuela. I will develop this idea, that is my main thesis here to discuss with you. So the massive rate of imprisonment in El Salvador suggests that, as in Venezuela, the situation, I agree, the situation will become unsustainable. How long can these 24 hours a day monitoring can stand? Is it not foreseeable that the prisons will start to be neglected? That in the face of the abuses and neglect, the prisoners themselves will begin to get organized, full of rage and in need of regain, as has happened already in El Salvador, in Brazil, and in Venezuela. Again, time and volatility is two variables needed for our analysis. So in Venezuela, the prison population doubled in the space of 2 years between 2009 and 2011. Probably in El Salvador, as in our country, prisons will no longer be enough. A feasible step in a state of exception is, of course, to kill with impunity. So, as the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben taught us, in context of the withdrawal of constitutional guarantees and liberties of citizenship itself, the state can kill with impunity. The images that have circulated of those prisoners, of those deprived of liberty in the prisons of El Salvador, illustrate us about the harshness of being reduced to biological or bare life. In other words, living in a state of exception and experiencing what Giorgio Agamben has called nuda vida or naked life. So this is the experience of being deprived of the most basic rights and human capacities. In democracy, of course, the right to have rights and the right to raise our voice. The shift between carceral punitivism and systematic killings was expressed to us in Venezuela in an interview with a policeman that explained us, well, the prisons were jam-packed. What else could we do with these guys? We started to eliminate them. So I was struck at first, like in his discourse, this repetition of eliminate, that in fact it was translating what we were experiencing in Venezuela, this massive and repetitive killing in the poor neighborhoods. So in this sense, in Venezuela, the gathering in prisons, the gathering of all these young men and these criminals in prisons propelled new forms of organization and more sophisticated crime 5 years later. So we have to see what is going to happen in El Salvador in 5 years. So gangs began to have territorial control, heavy weapons in this flux of communication between prisons and in the poor barrios. But after this wave of carceral punitivism and more organized gangs, in 2015, in an electoral period, Nicolás Maduro launched the military operative known as Operativos de Liberación del Pueblo. From 2016 to 2019, police forces were responsible for more than 4,500 killings. This is more than in Brazil. In Brazil, that is a country that has 200 million inhabitants. In 2016, police forces killed 4,200 people. In Venezuela, we have 29 million people. Police forces were responsible of even more killings. So what we started to experience in Venezuela can be called necropolitics, such as Cameroonian philosopher Akil Membe invites us to think, when the state lacking the capacity to guarantee biological life and the rule of law, its powers resides in its capacity to administer death. So the allegations were so serious that Venezuela is today being examined by the International Criminal Court, and we are in need of developing the adaptations of processes of transitional justice for the frame of Venezuela. Thinking again about El Salvador, an aspect that is very striking to me, in addition of the chilling images of those deprived of liberty, is the report for instance, in different newspapers, such as La Prensa Gráfica or the magazine Gato Encerrado or Crisis Group, is that the government had started to conceal the deaths, the information about deaths. And that practice, we know it very well in Venezuela. For instance, instead of categorizing deaths that has occurred with police confrontations or in prisons, they are not putting those deaths in homicides. They are putting these deaths in legal interventions. And that we know very well in Venezuela, when public officials had to give these courses. Of course, they said homicides were coming down, but they did not speak about legal interventions. They didn't speak about what other category, that is averiguación de muertes, or in deaths under the investigations. I will finish here just saying that in this context, I think that the work of Ignacio Martín Baró, the Jesuit priest that was killed in 1989 in El Salvador, His work is more than ever current and need when he speaks about social trauma in El Salvador, trying to grasp and to think about the social consequences beyond individual consequences of living in such a state of fear. I also have read a lot about this new feeling of fear, not because of the gangs, but of the police forces. But I think, I mean, of course, we are now in this very high peak of popularity of Bukele, but what happens when charisma gets routinized? That is what happened in Venezuela after Chavez and all. Then we have Maduro. I mean, what like Weber invites us to think, what happens when charisma gets routinized? I will leave it here. Thank you.
Will?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for having me on the panel, for joining the true experts here. Let me just make a couple broad comments. So one on the regime that we're seeing emerge in El Salvador, what sets that regime apart from other ones in Latin America. And second on the economy, which I think will become Bukele's Achilles heel in this next term, if he ever has one. So first on the regime. Look, I think we can call what's emerged under Nayib Bukele in El Salvador a competitive authoritarian regime, in the sense that, look, there's still space for some types of competition and criticism of the government. This is not Daniel Ortega's Nicaragua, right? Even opponents of Bukele who I met in the country told me that. Perhaps. But I think it's competitive authoritarianism with a twist, in the sense that usually what happens under competitive authoritarianism is that the governing party, the incumbent, opens or closes space legally using state resources in response to a threat from the opposition. And I think the trajectory we tend to see, Venezuela is the perfect example, is that as the opposition gets more and more organized, the incumbent party decides we can't leave whatever amount of space we had before for the opposition to operate. We need to shrink that space over time. I think the puzzling, the unusual thing about El Salvador is that Bukele has left open quite a bit of legal space for the opposition to operate, and yet the opposition has virtually collapsed. So we're seeing the opposition collapse not necessarily or primarily in response to the state bearing down with the full weight of all the repressive tools it has, like in Nicaragua a couple of years ago, or Venezuela shortly before that. What we're instead seeing is an opposition that's almost self-destructive. Yes, in an environment in which there's quite a bit of pressure on it, but I think we need to talk about what's happening with the opposition as well to understand the trajectory El Salvador has taken. Of course, the standard bearers of the opposition have been Arena, the traditional right-wing party, and FMLN Frente, the traditional left-wing party, both very discredited by the time that Bukele launched his independent presidential, or his bid apart from FMLN, where he started his career in 2019. And I think that we've seen them just continue on this trajectory of collapse since then. 2021 elections, they did even worse. And this time, we'll see what happens with the legislative results. We can't be certain what happened there yet. But in terms of the presidential vote, all told, they captured all the opposition parties, less than 15% of the vote. So, I think that's what makes this case a little different, is that so far we don't see opposition candidates widely barred from running. This isn't even as restrictive as Guatemala's election last year, where several opposition contenders were taken off the ballot. But what we are seeing is the opposition essentially collapse and leave this vacuum, this sort of political vacuum, if you will, that no other group or new opposition figures seem ready to fill. But that leads to a second question, which both of you were kind of hinting at, right? What's the chance that this does get more repressive? Just because all the repression isn't bearing down on the opposition yet, are the tools there? Are they in place? And after spending time in El Salvador talking to people both in the government and the opposition, I really believe the answer is yes. It's not only the state of exception. Nuevas Ideas has also made 38 very consequential changes to the criminal code in El Salvador, which means that even if the state of exception is lifted, many of the same broad legal powers they've had to go after people, to go after critics of the government on spurious charges are still going to be there. I mean, basically the way I see it is if tomorrow Bukele woke up and decided he wanted to be Daniel Ortega, there'd be nothing to stop him, legally or in terms of de facto powers. Just speaking for a moment about those powers, I tried to get a sense of whether the military, the police, even parts of the private sector might still have an ability to push back on Bukele if they wanted to. Perhaps it's just the case that they haven't wanted to yet. They're benefiting from the system as well as it exists. but they're saving up their ammunition, or down the road, you imagine they might try to constrain him. I get the strong sense that none of those outcomes are possible, that the military, the police have been purged of the type of people who would be able to check Bukele if they wanted to. So, just a couple of points on where this support comes from for a regime of the type I've just described. Just pointing to a few polls, 85% of Salvadorans surveyed last year feel safe. They say they feel safe under the state of exception. So that's something to consider. 90% surveyed last year think that the country is currently moving in a very positive direction or a positive direction. And I think those two types of support are very much linked. Bukele's legitimacy comes from the sense of security enjoyed by the overwhelming majority under the current status quo. And I say majority, of course, because of course there are people who are not feeling a sense of security. I, for instance, interviewed a priest who said that so many of his parishioners in one of the poorest parts of an area near San Salvador now ask him to write them letters when they leave their community, to have something to show to the police, whether they're going to a church function, going to buy food, they need some sort of proof of that they're not leaving the community for any crime-related reason. So obviously 10% or more of the population living with great amounts of fear, Luis, as you referenced, but many people feeling they're safer now today than before. I will say, walking around talking to Bukele supporters, I was kind of expecting to meet the voter who was a fanatical fan of Bukele, head over heels, would only admit that he'd done good things for the country. And I was surprised by the nuance I actually found in people's support. Many people would tell me that, yes, there have been trade-offs in terms of checks and balances, in terms of separation of powers. And almost no one told me that the economic situation was looking good. So I'll just use that as a segue to go to my second set of comments here on the economy. So Bukele, without a doubt, whether you approve of the way he did it or not, he transformed the security situation in El Salvador. He has not transformed the economy or resolved any structural barriers to inclusive economic growth in El Salvador. I'll just point to a few pre-existing challenges, which I think he inherited and which haven't gotten better. Then I'll talk about a couple of things which might be improving, and then the many things which I actually think are getting worse now, which could lead to a real source of instability. So first of all, what's the pre-existing economic situation that Bukele inherited? First of all, in almost any year when you go back over the last 20, 30 years, El Salvador has received the least foreign direct investment of all of its Central American neighbors, not in relation to GDP, raw numbers, right? Raw numbers, which is really striking. Textiles, the major export industry of El Salvador, faces increasing competition from industries in Asia, and seems to be on its way down. And the education system lags behind El Salvador's peers. 2 out of every 5 sixth graders doesn't graduate. Only 2 out of 5 sixth graders graduates high school. So that's the difficult situation that Bukele inherited. None of those fundamental obstacles to growth have changed. What's gotten better? What would the government point to as having improved in terms of what we could look to as a sign that there are brighter horizons economically? Well, first, obviously, the extortion carried out by the gangs is pretty much a thing of the past. I heard rumors that certain members of the military have taken over extortion in some communities, but nothing I could substantiate. We don't really know how much extortion cost the economy, but the Central Bank of El Salvador estimated in 2016 that it was something like 3% of GDP. So you see extortion lifted. I saw with my own eyes, and I heard from many people in El Salvador that informal economic activity, transport throughout the city, all of this, there's no longer these artificial breaks on where you could go, where you could sell, et cetera. Consumer spending is up a little bit, mostly driven by remittances. And then finally, it seems like FDI is just starting to inch up now. Not as much as the government would like us to believe, right? There's not this influx of FDI dollars into Surf City. I went down there, it's like there's not a ton of new construction or anything like that. A few sectors seem like they're picking up, but it's not this tidal wave the government would have you think. Now, I'll just conclude with what looks really bad, what's really concerning trend lines in terms of the economic situation. So number one is the debt burden. El Salvador is one of the most highly indebted governments in the region, and it's essentially lost access to all international sources of debt financing. It's become much too costly to borrow in the international market. Different lines of credit have dried up, and essentially what the government is turned to doing, a very desperate measure, a sign of fiscal distress, is that they're delaying payments the government owns into the pension system, which will make them more costly to pay back later. And they're simply not paying service providers at the local level. So companies that provide light, water, et cetera, that build public works, they're just not paying them for now. Now, what's the kind of get out of jail free card here? It's that El Salvador is banking on a big deal with the IMF, which looks more and more likely to happen. So I think a lot of attention should be on that deal later this year. What are the conditions that the IMF lays down? Two things are on the table right now. IMF says publicly that they want Bukele to get rid of his pet project and abandon Bitcoin as a legal tender. So I interviewed Vice President Felix Ulloa. I asked him, if you have to choose between getting rid of Bitcoin as legal tender and this life-saving loan from the IMF, which do you choose? And he said, easy choice, we keep Bitcoin. Bitcoin's, the hack of the future. We will make enough money off of the rising price of Bitcoin that will be flush with reserves and we'll be able to pay back our creditors on our own terms. Now, look, that could just be like the one day before the election bravado that he kind of wanted to bring to the table. But I am concerned, given that we know it's essentially Bukele and his two brothers deciding everything in the system, that if they really believe in Bitcoin, that they think that this was an inspired choice and that it's going to be the economic future of El Salvador, that they might just stick by it. But the even bigger obstacle to an IMF loan is basic transparency and budget oversight conditions, which come on pretty much any loan. I don't know of a single country which has said, no thanks, we're not going to open up any of our public contracting or provide any oversight on our budget, which is the current status of things in El Salvador. In fact, voices critical of the government told me that the almost existential threat to Bukele with agreeing to such terms is that it would lift up the cover on all types of corruption that have been going on inside the budgeting and contracting process, and essentially expose, the way he's distributing funds around to different political allies to keep his coalition together. So this IMF deal is going to be a real test for Bukele. Just on the kind of the final points here. IMF expects GDP growth to slow to 1.9%. So that's the Latin American average for 2024, but far too slow to get El Salvador out of this trap without any kind of loan or debt relief. We have seen in the past couple of years, numbers of households living in extreme poverty double, and several other signs of kind of ordinary everyday distress, of rising cost of living and other issues I can talk about in the break. So I leave off there with those comments on the regime and the economy, but in the Q&A, happy to discuss other issues like U.S. foreign policy towards El Salvador, and whether or not Bukele's security model can travel.
Thank you. So let me open with some comments and questions for you. So El Salvador is a pretty unique case, right? So first, the situation of the gangs inherited from U.S. migration policy. At some point, the U.S. deported people who were learning in the prisons. If you're talking about prisons, it was LA prisons, not Salvadorian prisons, where these people learned their trade, and then they were deported to El Salvador. And that was the first kind of hit. It's a country with a lot of weapons. It's coming out of a civil war. So, relatively easy. It's a country with very little democratic experience, if you think about it. There was the transition in the 90s, a pacted transition. We know by now that pacted transitions tend not to work. Venezuela is obviously the example where the opposition to Chavez disappeared, but we are seeing this happening even in Chile, right? So, which is a case with a long democratic experience. So what I find extremely surprised about Bukele is all of the other cases, even those that become very authoritarian, like Nicaragua or Cuba, started with redistribution. This is the only case I know where there's no economic redistribution. It's only, I guess, security redistribution. That I understand. But zero economic redistribution. I cannot think of any other example in Latin America of someone building its charisma and popularity on just security and not food redistribution. I think Chavez, it's an appropriate example, and I don't think Chavez ever lost his charisma. He died. So
no, exactly, but the charisma.
But Maduro never had charisma. That's a problem, right? You put an idiot because you don't want competition, then you die, and the idiot inherits the show.
Exactly.
But I mean, the reality is the charisma is on the first person. I don't think Chavez ever lost the charisma.
No, he never.
So the comparison, but Chavez redistributed. I mean, the economy went crazy, but people thought, at least at the beginning, an improvement in their economic conditions. El Salvador, I find extraordinary in that there is no economic redistribution or improvement. I mean, there is the improvement on security, and so that it's a very attractive model across the region because like the region is not growing, economic redistribution is looking harder and harder to provide. And here is something that seems to be building popularity, security, and security is getting worse and worse across countries in the region. So if there is a model that should be attractive now, is this one, right? Because it's the cheapest way of becoming popular. So I guess if you guys had any reaction to this uniqueness of El Salvador and whether it could be exported to other countries.
I think just one thing, the polls before, the first problem was security. The second problem was economy.
That's true in every country.
Yeah,
Those
but
two are top.
the thing was like the bar was so low from other political powers, political parties in power, that when he gave $300 to the
I know.
families,
During the pandemic.
yeah, I remember one lady, she is like 70 years old. She was like so committed to him because she said like literally, this is the first time in my life that I received, and you can hear her with that passion, like the first time I received this kind of money. I never in my life had like this amount of money. It was just $300 that is going to cost us like much more. But the people who received those $300, for them, that was like, it is not distribution at all, but it was a sign that things are going to change. And on top of that is like security measures. And then with the Bitcoin thing and all of that, he gave $30 more. But for people was like, yeah. And when you go to the barber shop, like you can hear like people talking with the barber. Oh yeah, I'm doing like a Forex and that. And I learned like I'm winning money. So all of those things are summing up to say, okay, we're seeing change. Yeah.
Yes, well, I will say that the Bukele's model, of course, is not exportable because all Latin American countries have very different situations. El Salvador, as Jose Miguel Cruz always points, it's such a small country. And then, for instance, think about Ecuador right now. All these important organized armed actors that are contesting the state authority.
It's true. El Salvador doesn't have a market for drugs.
No.
And doesn't produce drugs. So
Exactly.
It's just passing.
And then also, for instance, in other Latin American countries, the states are fragmented, and its police and military forces sometimes are in contradiction and in competition. And armed actors, you have plenty of different armed actors in competition. So it's a unsustainable model for other countries. But it is what I am really worried about, that it is a model that, as we have said here, that it's very popular in terms of electoral discourses and promises, and but then massive human rights violations again for the country.
Just a couple points that build off those about what I think makes El Salvador unique, has made it unique, and would make it very hard for another country to do something like this. I mean, one is I described the gangs that existed in El Salvador as high on coercion and their use of very brutal forms of coercion, which obviously made them hated by large parts of the population, and very low on resources, both financial resources from the lack of a revenue stream in terms of drugs. The amounts they were extorting, according to the Salvadoran government, and what they were actually seizing extortion money was like in the tens of thousands of dollars for some years. So I think they were high coercion and really, there was a lot of social rejection of these gangs, but making it popular to try to defeat them. But they were low resources, so they had little to push back. And I don't know that we see that same mix anywhere else in the region, or even a country that would give rise to that. The security forces, I think a point to add is that they had very good intelligence on where the gang members, the leaders of the gangs, et cetera, were, because these were gangs that were deeply rooted in certain communities. So they knew for years, but weren't necessarily fully free to act because they were operating in sort of a democratic rule of law bound state. And then finally, I think you can't explain what's happened in El Salvador without authoritarianism. And I don't know that we're going to get this. I would think it'd be highly unlikely that anywhere else we'll see power concentrated so tightly in, one set of hands. Partly because the sort of story of party collapse I referenced earlier in my opening remarks, this collapse of the traditional parties, that's already happened in most Latin American countries decades ago. And now you have this kind of political melee between a dozen different factions, none of which wants to give up their own space, right? So I don't think you'll get the sort of collapse of the existing political system and just this wholesale vacuum opening up where one person can move in and concentrate power. To me, those are the three factors that make El Salvador unique. But I would say that I don't think that will limit the ability for this model to have an appeal abroad or to convince. I don't think people will take those reasons as, oh, okay, well, now that you've told me that, I don't think we should try the Bukele model in X country, right? In a way, and I guess we could debate this, it reminds me a bit of the situation, in a very inverse and flipped way, the situation of the Cuban Revolution in the 1960s, right? So a small, relatively small country has a social revolution, achieves things, if you want to see it that way, which many people didn't consider possible, and then inspires many follow-up movements all over the region in countries with completely different social and political contexts, where attempts to replicate that initial model go very, very badly wrong, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't think we'll see something on that scale of copycat Bukele trying to implant this model elsewhere, but I thought a little bit about the parallels.
Okay, questions? Yes, Tara?
So thank you all for being here. It's also interesting to have like the range of perspectives. I think one thing that for me is interesting is this idea of it working, right? I think like it's very easy to sort of criticize like what it has done to democracy and the institutions and whatnot. But what Vicky's point was about like poverty versus, thinking about maybe the security redistribution, like I think what do you say to people who said like before it was bad, like now it's better? And how can you like possibly convince people to like turn their backs on something that is delivering, right? When before, under a democratic system and those like traditional political parties, they didn't deliver, right? It's sort of the sense of like, maybe, yeah, one day it'll go badly wrong in the sense that there will be more killings or there will be more reasons to sort of resent the government, but then by that point, it's also far, far too late, right? The question I think is now like, I don't know, like thinking a little bit more about like not criticizing it, but sort of trying to see like, how people feel about this and like the fact that it is delivering and that it has redistributed security in this way, right? Like I think that's the thing that's sort of hard is for, especially from the outside, to be like, oh, democracy, when for people living in that situation, like you couldn't leave your house and now you can leave your house, right? So I think in terms of trying to not make it, I mean, even in Costa Rica, there are calls to replicate this model, right? In a country where it's also a small country, and I think there's also, it's easy to say like not be as, likely that power gets concentrated in one set of hands, but.
He's the most popular politician in Chile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else who wants to
So-
take on that?
I think it's hard, because, for example, my organization works grassroots levels, and people don't care about the abstract concept of democracy or governance, because they care about having a roof under their heads and food. I think maybe this is not a solution, but it's like keep working with the people at that level to show them in different ways that at some point democracy is important, and right now is still the only way that we can like have human rights, because at some point maybe the lady who cleans or who cooks in the community, they're going to take away her husband or her son, and maybe her son is not a gang member and he's going to die in jail. Maybe that is not going to happen for everyone, but when it happens to you, that's the moment, I think, the breaking point. But rather than that, I don't think there's like strategy or something that organizations or like people can do to convince them otherwise until it happens to you. Yeah.
Well, I will say that, of course, it's very important to connect and to have empathy with people's daily worries. But another thing is also to question what has been the experience of democracy. Because if it is only an electoral democracy, that is one thing. But we have not, or in Salvador, people has not experienced what it means a democracy with social rights. That is one important part of democracy, of course. And then thinking again about the security policies, if they don't deal with poverty and the situation that young men are experiencing in the country. I mean, it's so predictable that in, let's say, 4 or 5 years, what is going to happen? I mean, already 1 or 2% of the population is put in prison. What system can support that? I mean, the network of people that will begin, as you said, to have somebody in prison or somebody killed by the police is going to become wider and wider. So it's a question of time.
Nothing particular to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, one point that you guys didn't bring up that reminds me of this is this phone number. I mean, El Hilo and Central have made 6 episodes on El Salvador. It's a great podcast. And there was one point about the importance of this anonymous phone number where people can call to denounce and how it has broken communities because people denounce, like, you know, you fight with someone. I mean, I guess Calibas wrote this about the war. Like people get denounced for whatever reason, and then the person is gone forever. So there is something about social structure there as well that makes the challenge, I think, even worse. There was a question there in green, yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about.
If you can introduce yourself.
My name is Caio. I'm last semester of the EFA program from Brazil, and I'd like to know to which extent you believe that people supporting this regime in other countries like in Chile and Brazil, they are organized. And it's a strategy, international strategy to promote the solution for security, which is mainly in Latin America, or if it's spontaneous. We are seeing actors like reproducing the narrative and saying, oh no, the crime is going on now, you know, you need to intervene in the Congress, Supreme Court, because it's the only way otherwise. And then, of course, if you are opposition in your country, and you think all the institutions are corrupted, say, oh, maybe this is the solution. So we are seeing more people that they are not so supportive of democracy. The democracy is not are the best option. So do you think it's like opportunistic from international players to be sticking to this and trying to bring to the other countries, or it's organized? You know what I mean? Like when Trump got elected here, you have Cambridge Analytica and have national connections to promote the same strategy in other countries. You think it's going to happen in other elections? Huh?
Will, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, from everything I've seen, the people I've talked to, I don't think Bukele is investing a lot of resources in organizing supporters in other countries. Like, yeah, Buenos Ideas started a little chapter in Guatemala that didn't go anywhere. You know, does he like receive Xiomara Castro's sons when they come and visit and ask for advice about how to do their state of exception? Yes. But it doesn't seem to me that he's as focused. I think he's more interested in having sort of soft power among US conservatives and business people abroad, kind of painting a picture of El Salvador as this destination for investment. I think he's more invested in that than looking elsewhere in Latin America and how can he help organize followers. And in terms of those people who have said that they'd like to copy him, Rafael Lopez Arriaga, for instance, the mayor of Lima, Jan Topic, who campaigned for the presidency in Ecuador. We've either seen them not be able to do it. Xiomara Castro is an example of that. It's not really gone anywhere, her attempt to copy Bukele. They've walked back the comments like Rafael Lopez Arriaga and had to admit, look, yeah, Lima's a very different place than San Salvador. Or they haven't won, like Jan Topic in Ecuador. So far, I don't think we've seen someone actually campaign with this extreme mano dura message and win. Not even, I'll add, Bukele himself, because when he campaigned for the first time in 2019, this was not his calling card, and this wasn't his lead.
Okay, Isa?
2 quick questions. One is, if we can have more of your opinion of analysis on the pattern of deteriorating and reducing government budgets to pay the money to the people in the region. I think this is something that is common between Colombia, Venezuela, and Mexico. These governments to taking the money out of the governments to give it straight to the people and buy votes. And the other question is, how are you accounting the debts and the missing in El Salvador? What are your sources, and you're building a registry for that?
With the second question, there's like different institutions who are like gathering information in different spaces, but nothing is from the government actually, because they well, as you mentioned, they are like hiding the information, and they are kind of putting makeup in the killings, for example, and we don't have information from the government, for example, of the people who died in the jails. But journalists and some think tanks from here in the US, they find people, they found different like kind of whistleblowers, kind of, that share the information, that send them the data. And yeah, and also a lot of grassroots work, talking with the families, the people who they take their families related, yeah.
Well, about the distribution of benefits, also, Bukele has a direct relationship with the people. I mean, it's we can see that in the social media, that it's a sort of a very important personalism, such as we might say Chavez had too. And it's particular because I was reading a lot these days, and then there are some Venezuelan advisors near Bukele. And some of these strategies, such as giving people, for instance, just before the elections, giving people food
Like a box of food.
like boxes of food, that in terms of people's feelings of recognition are so important, but actually is the reduction of social rights and benefits, but symbolically it's so important. So what we can see is this dynamic of this personalistic leader giving little things to people in order to get stronger this direct relationship between the leader and the people.
Add anything?
Well, yeah, I'd only add that I think the fiscal situation I talked about earlier just doesn't allow for, besides a little bit around the elections, any kind of more sustained institutionalized transfers in a significant way. You know, like you can look at López Obrador, who's kind of done his Republican austerity to shrink the state in some places, free up more resources for cash transfers and other types of programs elsewhere. That kind of rebalancing is happening in El Salvador, but it's just to keep the lights on and just to pay the interest on the debt. I mean, when Bukele, for instance, shrunk the number of municipal governments, that was in a way kind of a radical act, just try to consolidate expenses and just, you know, keep the deficit from becoming too big to even manage. So, yeah, I think that even with an IMF loan, they're not going to be in the position to kind of become economically populist like that.
Okay, yes.
My name is Ernesto. I'm a Salvadoran student at the law school. My question is about the US foreign policy towards Salvador. Just put my question in context. 2 years ago, when Bukele started to, how to say, talk about re-election and all that, and also the Supreme Court ruling on re-election, the United States issued a kind of like a communique or whatever. Statement saying that the re-election was unconstitutional and it was a threat to democracy and to rule of law and whatever. And some days before the election, a month before the election, this election, the United States said, okay, this is a question that the Salvadorans need to resolve by voting or not voting for Bukele, which is for me just a bad argument. And also Secretary Blinken was the first international, let's say, politician who congratulated Bukele for this election. So what's your understanding of this shift in US foreign policy?
It is popularity. Actually, we had a conversation with Will a few weeks ago, And yeah, that happened. Like the embassy was very different with Jane Maines, for example, towards Nayib. She was very publicly that the relationships are not good, were not good at the moment, and then she left. She left because the politics, like the foreign policy from the US towards El Salvador, they want to shift that. That's why they send the new ambassador, Duncan, who is like a minor figure, I could say. He's just saying like, okay, we, for example, before the election process, he was interviewed and his answer was like, okay, yeah, we're going to see how the Salvadorian people is going to choose their next president and Congress. We think that it's going to be a free and fair election, and we're not going to meddle, something like that. But then you see Secretary Blinken congratulate him, even though we didn't have the official result from the Supreme Electoral Tribunal. So yeah, right now, the US foreign policy, because of his popularity, is to let him do what he's doing right now. Is like they're not going to say, at least publicly, for what I've seen, nothing against him, because they know that is contraproducent for them. A lot of, for example, Ilhan Omar signed a statement against the re-election, and it was full of trolls. Another representative from the Congress attacked her too. The Bitcoin bros from the US attacked her too. Like they know that they manage a massive communication strategy that is going to be contraproducent to the US.
Will, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think the embassy's kind of theory of the case is that the only way to maintain leverage with Bukele, himself makes every relevant decision, is to go directly to him, right? And you have to keep a channel of communication open with him, or you will have no seat at the table and no ability to sway any kind of outcome. What do I think their goals are? I mean, I think it's, I think there's an attempt to get the state of exception ended, or at least a timeline for ending it. As I said earlier, I'm not sure how consequential that would really be because of these significant, almost 40 changes to the criminal code that make much of it permanent. I also think that there's a danger here. I don't know this is the case, but I think there's a danger that some figures in US foreign policy think of Bukele as a relatively benevolent dictator. And might be very worried about who comes next, but look at him and say, for the time being, he seems like he wants to do what's right on the economy.
Let me follow up. I see a completely different thing. There's two things that will affect the next election this year in the US. Inflation and migration. We don't have El Salvadorians coming to the US.
The numbers have gone up in the last
But
month.
to the extent to which he's popular and this place is stable, even if it's by this sheer coercion, it's like, one less problem to think about, like, right? The problem in Ecuador, So I think a lot of the US policy towards Central America and Mexico is basically try to think through migration. Because that's going to affect the presidential election in the US, but you don't seem to think.
I'm not particularly convinced. I think with Mexico, absolutely, but with El Salvador, the numbers were quite low after 2019. I mean, they really started dropping then. That's when this confrontation was almost at its most intense. So I don't know. I mean, my gut would tell me, yeah, that's what's going on, because that is the number one issue with most countries. But the numbers being so small and the fact that they're now going up just as we're embracing him more and more. I mean, yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. Genesis?
Hi, Genesis, I'm senior at CC. I have two things that are just kind of like going in my head right now that I'm trying to understand. One of them being Bukele's foreign relations and the other being his control over the course of force, because he mentioned that he kind of purged anyone who could challenge him from the police, from the military. And I'm wondering if there could be any event, I'm from Nicaragua for context, there could be any event where he has to use the coercive force against what he calls gente honrada, like civilians that aren't gang members or anyone who's tattooed. And that could lead to dissent from the coercive force. And another being that when this happened in Nicaragua, when the police was used against civilians, a lot of the police forces resigned. And Danilo Correa was forced to get people from Cuba to be paramilitaries in Nicaragua. And I'm wondering if El Salvador has allies like this, because I know that he's coming for CPAC, and I know that like Xi Jinping recently reached out and he's like gonna start relations. But these all seem kind of contradictory to me, and I'm wondering who could actually like be his ally if something like this happens, the likelihood of something like that. Yeah, I don't know if that's too all over the place.
I think for the police question, right now he made some examples. For example, one of the biggest, and that was like, this is private company, like the people who run the buses, the public transportation. He made this example of him and put him into jail to show, because he was like the biggest public transportation businessman, and he put him into jail to show everyone that he has the control, because at that moment they were discussing something about the fee of the public transportation system. And I'm bringing this because it's the same example right now. No one in the government, I think, is going to go against him because he's so popular. For example, the people in Congress, the people like the citizens, they don't know them. Like they don't care about the Congress. That's why they are so worried right now. And the other example, 2 days ago or 3, one of the security advisors of the presidency died in jail. He was in prison by the same government who he worked. And this is the first case that is being shown like so publicly. So people in government, even if they have power, they're not going to go against him. For example, there was this other case, and this is not, I don't know if it's 100% true, but he was a minister of security and he was planning to run. And that was like the conversation in like the political spectrum in El Salvador. And he just disappeared of the public sphere. They didn't kill him or anything. He just disappeared, take a step back, because they knew what he was doing. And yeah, it's just him. It's just the president. It's just his image. And the other people is, yeah, disposable.
Any of you two want to add anything?
I think that one, the police and military, from the people I talked to, the remaining members probably would crack down. And that when might they have opportunity or reason to do so? I think that the soonest we could see that is if this IMF deal goes through and there needed to be some kind of painful austerity cuts to health, education, subsidies, something like that, that would potentially bring people out onto the street. I'm not sure if they would come out onto the street in response to those
She
cuts.
asked a question that I don't know the answer, that I think is good. Who could be potential international allies? So could China provide a swap? Could like, is there an alternative to the IMF? That could like, when Argentina needed money, China established a base in the Patagonia that nobody can enter except the Chinese government, right? And suddenly there was a Chinese swap. I mean, yeah, at least you guys have like maybe a code that's of interest or something. I mean, there are alternatives to IMF.
I think actually the US foreign policy is going to come back again because the US doesn't want an economic mess in El Salvador, because that is going to translate to people migrating. So they really don't want that. So I think, I don't know if the IMF agreement is going to go through, but I know that the US doesn't want an economic disaster in El Salvador. And also, Nayib he likes to flirt with China. And when you put China into the US,
And
okay,
it's not that
let's
much money
talk.
as well. It's a really small economy.
Yeah.
Martina and Oscar, in that order.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I wanted to know if you know how much the national budget invested in security has increased, if they publish numbers on that. Maybe.
I don't personally have the number off the top of my head,
Yeah, I don't have it.
Oscar?
but I was just gonna say, but I do know that soldiers and police salaries increase substantially.
Yeah, so just following up on Lisa's comment of, he's like, some cases with elites that have defected from the party in a way, like, what do you guys think, like, will keep the party together? Because there's not much to redistribute in El Salvador, like, we don't have natural resources. So like, right now it's his charisma, his popularity that no one can face him, but like, all these other Congress people, like, what's gonna keep them from defecting from CIS?
Because they are afraid of him. And that already happened. For example, there was like this faction of people in Congress who start talking with the embassy of the US. And then they expel one of the people in Congress. I don't remember his name because I don't remember the names of the people in Congress of Nuevas Ideas, and the majority of people in El Salvador is the same. I think it's making examples. If you know that you can be a Congress, before I think you had more power being in Congress, but now it's not like that. I really think that he's going to maintain like the tightness. I think just two names are going to be key to maybe the castle to crumble. And we didn't spoke about this, but it was like the deals that he made with the gangs before. And I think that's important because we didn't discuss this. And Osiris Luna, who is in charge of jails, and also I don't remember. I just remember the other name. Sleep something. Carlos Marroquin. He is a gang member. He is in the Magnitsky list and also in the Engels list. He broke the deal with the gangs, and he was the one who moved this gang member who is right now here in New York.
To the border with
to Guatemala. He gave him a gun. He knows a lot of things about the deal. But once again, also Alejandro Mason, who now is dead, he knew.
My guess is that Marroquin will soon be dead as well, right? And if you know too much.
I'm from the countries of wonder, so I wonder a lot of things.
Not very safe situation. But so you see no risk of an alternative from within?
At this moment, I don't think so. Yeah, no.
That over there.
Hi, my name is Dennis and I'm part of the organization Migrantes por Guatemala. And my follow-up is with Will. When he talks about opposition, to have a chance to fight for democracy, you need a healthy opposition. And El Salvador doesn't have that now. FMLN and Arena are pretty much a joke. Like, people just laugh at them because they have been the establishment and people don't want that. So what do you think? Do they wait to have a new opposition of young people that haven't been involved in corruption, or they just wait for Bukele's popularity to go away to have a chance to regain some seats?
That's a good question for the opposition themselves. I don't know, operating in this the kind of space of fear that Luis is talking about. Also, what can you do to organize? I mean, just anecdotally, when I was there meeting up with critics of the government, and not like front page of the news kind of critics, they'd often ask me to meet in kind of unusual places, leave phones in the car, check extensively if we're being followed or not. So that's the conditions for people who aren't visibly in politics. So then you imagine the people who would enter in. As I said earlier, I mean, I think the legal space for people to compete right now is still pretty open, but the de facto space, maybe, heavily monitored. What's the strategy for the opposition? I don't see Arena and Frente making a comeback at this point. In a way, I think that, there was an attempt to form a sort of opposition unity front early on in these elections that crumbled in part because the Arena and Frente still had too much of a loyal base of militants who wanted the party to run their own candidates kind of hopelessly. Now that they disintegrate, or when they soon disintegrate, will that allow space for a new opposition to emerge? Maybe. I kind of have my Claudio Ortiz of Vamos, who seems like a younger face and kind of a different type of a new voice of opposition, but that's just one person. So I think it's for the future to decide.
And also in foreign policy, like, we had two different ways of the United States acted when it comes to democracy. And we have an example in Guatemala. Like, everybody rallied behind Guatemala for the new president to take government. And with El Salvador, it was like, oh, we're gonna let Salvadorian people decide. So at the end of the day, it was a popular thing because the government in Guatemala was very unpopular.
Paul, you had a question?
Yes, I'm Paul Hassian, a visiting researcher at ILAS, from Argentina. And my question is for the three of you, and it's this seems like a torsion of very common topics and processes and institutions like punishment, penalty, punishment, penal populism, etc. That's all the elements of what happens in other places, but with some new elements. And my question, out of not much knowledge, but it's basically, what is the role of courts? What has been happening with courts, with prosecutors, with the judicial community in the face of these abuses before in Venezuela, and how is it playing out in El Salvador? The courts, because all of what you're describing is directly related with punishment. It's like a massive punitive operation. But for that, usually the courts and judges are participating. And traditionally, they're a liberal side of defense, but how are they participating in this process?
I can speak, for instance, what happened in Venezuela is that, and that is also the danger with situations of moral panic, and then with the social acceptability of the mano dura policies, and also in a state of authoritarian governments, that prosecutors and police forces began to coordinate. So then you have what in the literature we call a whole machinery of atrocity. So what we can learn of El Salvador, if he destituted the general attorney in 2 years ago, so what can we expect of this?
But he's having like collective trials, right? Like
Yeah.
in Cuba during the revolution, so they are trying many people at the time.
Like 500 people at the same time. So what kind of processes?
So
can
yeah,
we
there are
have?
no real.
But he has the control of everything. He removed the Supreme Court judges, and then he make like, I don't know if it's like, it was like 20% of judges to retire.
Anyhow,
No.
okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Carlos, I'm member of the Foreign Policy Association. You mentioned that we can apply the whole model because the particular reality of El Salvador. But for you, what parts of the model can be useful to fight against the criminality in South America, like the Tren of Aragua in Peru or Ecuador?
Well, I will say that the Tren of Aragua is a result of this kind of models, precisely in the sense that this carceral punitivism started in 2010, and then in 2014, I mean, 4 years after, you started to have all these gang in prisons. And then this expansion of the gangs prisons to the different barrios. So what we know in the literature and in the research of crime is that all these massive incarcerations produce more sophisticated and more organized criminal groups. So that is for sure. What we don't know right now is how sustainable this model is, because prisons are watched 24 hours, they have cameras. So how long can this model?
Yeah, but I think the question puts, like, we are telling people this model is not sustainable, but they were living in fear. They couldn't go out of their house. They couldn't play. Their kids couldn't play in the playground. They couldn't go to the neighborhood where their relatives lived. And suddenly, they can do it. You said, this is not going to be sustainable. Okay, but now I can do these things. And the other, it's not that it's working better, in the neighboring countries. It's not that Honduras or Costa Rica are providing a better option. So it's hard to make the case, I mean, I don't like the consequences, but it's hard for the population to make the case that this is not working because it will not work in the future, which is basically the argument about sustainability. So I think we have to grapple with I understand why politicians like Bukele and like to promise the Bukele way, although it doesn't work in Honduras and it doesn't work in other countries. But it's a reality that people can walk out. And this affects especially the poorest people. So, remember Carlos Dada came here and said the same things. But yes, I mean, if you are middle class or upper middle class, you could always live in a protective way. But, if not, if you had no alternative, suddenly at least you can walk out, even if it's a terrible situation, compared with the past, it seems better. And you're telling me the future will be worse, but I don't know.
Yeah.
But I have the impression that also very quickly we are starting to see the, ¿cómo se dice? Las ranuras o las brechas,
the cracks.
The cracks of the model within the population when fear becomes to be a pervasive feeling, and then it's not the gangs, but it is the police forces or the military. So
I don't know, you guys know the surveys and I have no idea.
I haven't done
expert on El
surveys,
Salvador, but he gave the example of someone who was
Yeah.
happier, although he himself had been in prison.
but also the pervasive fear.
Yeah. Yeah, but still, I think what you were saying, like in the short term, that's what they are feeling. So
Exactly.
yeah.
I think it's a great question. I think if there's a lesson to me to take away, and it's not that I think it's the right way to get to this outcome is the way Bukele did it, but it's that the state in El Salvador seems to have control of the prisons. I mean, nobody thinks the gangs now control the prisons, right? So I think that's a pretty powerful message, and hopefully there's a democratic way to get there. I look at the case of Ecuador. Biggest number one problem to me in Ecuador is that the SNI, the prisons bureaucracy, has been completely ineffective in the last few years at controlling the prisons. Clearly, corruption entering right through multiple different channels. The reason you have high-powered weapons entering the prisons in Ecuador, you have, gang leaders like Fito filming music videos in prison and then just walking free. That's the situation that's really unsustainable. And I don't think Bukele gives us the perfect route to get there, but one, I think, achievement you can talk about in El Salvador is that at least that's not the status quo now.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Ronaldo. I'm a MPA in Development Practice, first year. Also president of LASA, the Latin American Student Association. I have two questions. One, I know Bukele has this huge presence on social media, but I was curious about general press, how they interact with him and they criticize, they're in a position, they're just aligned with the government. My other question is, I'm Brazilian, so in Brazil, the gangs, they sustain themselves with drug dealing and other kind of illegal economic activities. I was curious about if El Salvador is not a producer or how they sustain themselves, so how the gangs find money to
remittances
and be there.
Extortion and remittances, right?
No remittances, no.
No, but the people have money because of remittances, and so they can extort because there is some money.
But the main people who they extorted, it was the private sector.
And the poor too.
Yeah, the poor, but it was
street sellers and the informal economy as well, and agriculture. And the press, I know really well.
No, the press, I only know that El Faro had to leave El Salvador, and it's now in Costa Rica. And Carlos Dara, they have all, I mean.
He was here last year.
Yeah.
Jose Luis Sanz of El Faro told me that actually, and it's, I guess kind of little discussed, but Bukele spent the most of any candidate on traditional media in 2019. So it wasn't only a story of going viral on social media. He also played the traditional media game. Also, just anecdotally, I mean, I heard that now with the opposition newspapers, I think they're in an increasingly tough fiscal position, like El Diario de Hoy, where people used to take out ads in those papers are sometimes being coerced out of even doing that, and they're kind of being starved of revenue. So it raises the question, what sort of, if there is an opposition that eventually resurrects itself in this sort of vacuum that's forming now, where are they going to go to disseminate their message, and will they get as favorable of a treatment on X as as Bukele?
Maybe WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Okay, the last question. Yes.
Yeah, well, my name is Guillermo. I'm a PhD student in political science at CUNY. I have two questions. One, it's how widespread is security in El Salvador? Is it localized, as we have seen in Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico? And the second is that, is there any reliable evidence that police in El Salvador is behaving like other police forces in the region? Like, are they killing people, or they are imprisoning them? Yeah, basically.
And I would add, what's the level of corruption of the police, which is very high across the region?
I think there was a few cases of corruption and impunity towards the police. Right now, there's like a lot of abuses of power in different communities because they have the control. I don't know the statistics, but I know a few cases in which like the people in the community, like a minor, a girl, was touched by a police officer to like search. And that is happening like a lot with a lot of impunity. I don't know about killings because there's like not a lot of like confrontation now. They just take them and they put them in jail. I know that there's people dying in jail, gang members and people who are there. But yeah, just that I can. Okay.
You guys?
I was trying to remember, in crisis group, they were reporting, for instance, killings from May 2022, from May to August, and the confrontations between police forces and MARA members have augmented. The problem is that they are not registering these killings as homicides, but legal intervention, and this information is not being public. But in these killings, at least the police forces were responsible for 30% of the killings. So the hypothesis is that killings are augmenting, but are not being reported.
I'd only add that I think because of the dynamics we talked about earlier, where the Maras, the gangs didn't have the revenue streams from drugs, they didn't necessarily have that much money to co-opt or to buy off police and military. So I think, in some kind of way that made the problem less pervasive maybe than it is in Honduras or Guatemala. Not to say there aren't abuses happening now, but maybe it allowed for the development of police and in armed forces that don't look as corrupt as the neighboring.
So let me end with like a question where I want you to think beyond El Salvador. So what's unique about El Salvador, if you look at La Pop data, this is the country where the people are the happiest with their democracy in the region. There's no other country, right? Although we think it's a competitive authoritarianism, but that's not with the population thing. And I was surprised that last weekend when somebody reported, maybe it was the New York Times, they reported the results as Salvadorians are voting their democracy away, right? And so I thought that was an interesting take in what is democracy. Are we talking about liberal democracy, representative democracy, which includes separation of powers? And I think this is a discussion I remember when I taught when Chavez was alive, and what's his name, the US director that's very left wing and keeps doing, Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone went and interviewed Chavez and did this movie, and people told him in Venezuela, no, this is a democracy because the majority wants Chavez. Who cares that there's no separation of powers, right? So this is a different ideological sign, but it's not that different as a kind of process. So how do we think of democracy in El Salvador and in the region? If a leader is so popular that the majority wants that instead of democracy? Or liberal democracy. He wants a majoritarian rather than liberal democracy, or delegative democracy, if you want to use O'Donnell's term. Any thoughts? Oh, look at that. This is Bukele.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the last comment to get your reactions.
One of my favorite definitions of democracy is one of the simplest. It's a system in which parties lose power. And I don't see how Nuevas Ideas can lose power given the tools that Bukele has at his disposal. So while he may be very popular, to me, it's just plain to see that it's not a democracy. It's, to me, a popular dictatorship or a popular authoritarian regime, popular competitive authoritarian regime, whatever you want to call it. But just because there's widespread backing, I don't think that that's enough on its own to make a system democratic.
I will add that also what we are experiencing is how these leaders transforms the law. And then they got there through popular vote, but then start to change the laws. For instance, in Venezuela, Chavez lost the referendum for systematic re-election or indefinite re-election. And then he changed the law with these special powers that the National Assembly gave him. So what we can see is these processes, how these authoritarian leaders get to democracy through popular vote and then start to change the rules of the game, and they might stay there.
Luis, you have the last word.
He was elected in a democracy, that's right, but then he didn't even change the constitution to be reelected. And yeah, I think democracy is abstract for the Salvadorians, for many people, so that's not a priority. So of course they are going to support him. And for them, that is a democracy, for the people in the streets, even if it's not a democracy. I'm always ending these conversations in a dark tone. But yeah, it's what we have, and yeah,
I think you had the answer though, because, and this is your answer to Tara in the first question. Maybe democracy should not be just abstract. It should have a meaning that people can associate with. Okay, so we are ending on this note. I want to thank you all for coming, and in particular, thank the extraordinary panel we had that you guys can clap because you didn't raise your hand.